Let me find my notes.
You took notes during my presentation.
I did take notes during
That's
the presentation.
flattering.
So, there you go.
Okay. I was really tempted to retitle it like 50 Ways Not to Record a Choir in Virtual Reality. But,
The rest is just noise. Thank you. I think we can start now. So, Sarabeth, how you doing?
pretty good. How about you, Andrew?
I'm okay. So, yeah, I think we're just going to talk through some of the stuff that you did. I'm particularly interested in the virtualization side of it.
Right.
More so than, well, I'm interested in the music stuff, but technically our podcast is like an urban sound sort of thing.
Right, yeah.
So the relationship between the cathedral and its community, that's very cool. But let's get into it. I always suck at starting these things off.
You could always pretend it was like halfway through a conversation or something.
That's why we're recording right now.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the history of Notre-Dame Cathedral. Why are you looking at the acoustics as it changed throughout the years, and how did it change?
Right. Well, as you know, there was a rather large fire in 2019 that destroyed essentially the entirety of the roof of the cathedral. When the fire was put out, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, made the promise that they were going to rebuild the cathedral. And they launched that whole rebuild campaign with soliciting proposals for how to potentially create the cathedral anew for the modern 21st century, with lots of really hilarious proposals. I don't know how many of them you saw, but...
I think I saw one that was proposing like a whole like glass addition sort of thing on it, which... No.
Yeah. So some of my favorite joke proposals were like putting a miniature Eiffel Tower in place of the spire that was burned down.
Couldn't they just put the actual Eiffel Tower in the spire? That would have been
that was
great.
Another one I saw actually was like just make a copy of the Eiffel Tower and put it on top of the cathedral. I saw ones of like, let's put a swimming pool up there. It was like a lot. And I find all of those proposals really funny, but returning to the promise to rebuild the cathedral, that makes the assumption that there was one cathedral to rebuild. And we kind of have this modern idea. I think it's a little bit, it's like a preference or a bias towards the present, where we look at this ancient cathedral that's over 150 years old and think that it has always existed the way that it exists as we know it. When in reality, it was in a constant state of construction for the first 100 years of its life.
Clearly Victor Hugo solidified it.
Yeah.
It's been the same since then.
Yeah. Ever since he wrote Notre-Dame de Paris, or I guess the way we call it in English, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, because we can't confuse the building with the novel. Once he wrote it, everything stopped changing, and that was it.
And should stop it.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
Never make
in
it
the 1800s.
different. Exactly.
Never change.
Perfect.
So sort of in speaking in broad outlines, Paris at the time that the cathedral began construction was already an important city in France. Don't quote me on this. There, I believe, was already a royal presence on the island that Notre-Dame was eventually constructed on. And there was a very significant liturgical community that was operating on Ile de la Cité at the time. There were a lot of churches that had been built, and they were built in honor of different saints. And there's actually some ambiguity about which church honored which saint. But they had a large cathedral in place that was very ancient. It was built sometime in the 4th or 5th centuries and seems to have been sort of the one grand cathedral of the community. In 1163, something notable happened that was not on the island in Paris. It was in what is now a suburb of Paris called Saint-Denis, which is the home of the royal necropolis of France. In 1163, a new cathedral was opened. It was sort of the first true Gothic cathedral in France. It's beautiful if you ever get a chance to visit it. But my hunch is that the opening of the cathedral in Saint-Denis probably sparked a few opinions in
Paris. A bit of jealousies?
Yes, possibly. Because that same year, as far as we can tell, they began breaking ground for the cathedral that eventually became Notre-Dame. And they also started, as far as we can tell, dismantling this old cathedral that had been built on the same site. So if you were to look at like a floor plan of the modern cathedral and this ancient cathedral, they're sort of overlapping near the area of the giant rose window and the bell towers. So 1163, they start construction on Notre Dame. They start building from the apse, which is the circular part of the building. And they keep building for about 20 years. At the 20-year mark, they've built the apse, but they haven't built the rest of the cathedral, and they consecrate the inside of the apse for use in religious ceremony. In order to allow themselves to start using the cathedral, they build this giant dividing wall, and they separate the worship site from the active construction site. So while the liturgical community is worshiping inside the cathedral, they're still building and building and building, but it will take them another 40 years or so before they finish the transept and the nave, and they tear down the dividing wall, and the entire cathedral is now open, at least in terms of its length.
And at that point, is it in the relatively similar to the modern?
Yeah, I would describe it as relatively similar. There's one big change that happens after they open the length of the cathedral, and that's they begin to expand the outer walls and pushing. This is hard to describe with words only instead of looking at a picture, but the famous flying buttresses of French Gothic cathedrals have a footprint that's roughly a long rectangle. And in the 1220s, the flying buttresses stuck out of the building. So if you were looking at it, the outside of the building would look a little bit like a giant comb because you had a buttress and then a void and then another buttress. The architects of the cathedral realized that they could tear out the interior wall in between the buttresses and instead build it pushed out from where it was, essentially smoothing the outline of the cathedral if you look at it from the outside, and adding rows of small side chapels along the perimeter. So you essentially widened the church by 2 vaulted bays, and you also added some length to the church as the buttresses at the very end of the apse were divided into larger, more grandly decorated chapels.
And did those chapels, those extensions, form part of the main acoustic space, or are they separated with a door or something like that?
So that's a good question. From what I've been able to find out from my architecture historian partners, when they were first opened, there were screens that separated these external chapels from the main space. But those screens would likely have been at least semi-transparent. So one of the things I'm really interested in is sort of exploring the relationship of acoustic subspace and acoustic main space inside the cathedral as it began to open up each of these side chapels.
Okay, so at this point, we've got, I guess, 4 sort of distinct constructions. We have the original Gothic cathedral, which is much smaller, just a straight rectangle, right? We then have the interim construction of the Notre-Dame, which has just the apse.
Yes,
right? Apse. With the big old wall behind it.
Right.
So it's smaller. It's got half of it is round, that sort of stuff.
I've been referring to it as micro Notre-Dame in my notes. Yeah.
Then we've got the first narrower construction where they've opened up the whole length of it.
Yes.
And then we've got the more modern where they've extended out the buttresses. Yes. So your research was then, okay, how did these different constructions impact the acoustics, and then how did that impact the composition of music and performance of music, right?
Yeah, because humans have been using the cathedral basically since they consecrated the apse, and at least for the time period in the 12th and 13th centuries when the most major renovations were being made to the architecture, a new development in music was happening. So in that time period, the composers who were performing and working in the liturgical community there went from composing what you might call a plain organum, which is a two-voiced but heterophonic style of Gregorian chant, where one voice carries the melody and the other one imitates it at the interval of a perfect fourth or fifth. We went from a plain organum to the development of a style called organum Notre-Dame. Any guesses why? Which introduced early polyphony to the music of the region. It's considered to be a very important time period in the development of music theory in Western Europe.
Does that kind of count as like the introduction of polyphonic voices in Western music? Or in Western sacred music, I suppose?
Yeah, I guess the best way to describe it is it's one of the first times we see polyphonic music written down.
Yeah.
There is always, of course, the potential that improvisational music was polyphonic at this point, but at the very least, it is some of the earliest examples of written polyphony that we have surviving.
And I think that just kind of the name of it answers a question I've had quite a while from some other presentation I've seen on similar things, which is, do the advances in architecture drive the changes in music, or is it perhaps changes in music and people wanting to push and do something different drives a change in architecture of these spaces? And the fact that it's named after Notre Dame and Notre Dame isn't named after the music,
right,
feels like it's going the first way. The change in the architecture,
right, is,
now, do you think it's, we need more complexity, or is it we can have more complexity?
So there's a couple factors at play with the development, some of which we know and some of which we're actively studying. So at the time period, high-ranking members of the clergy were patrons of the art just as much as they were servants of the church. And we do have records that are, I wouldn't call them truly contemporaneous, but relatively contemporaneous, from about 50 years after the height of innovation as we know it, making comments about how the bishops and other high members of the church would commission the style of music to be special music to be performed on particularly important feast days. So we know there was some pressure from the leaders of the church and of the clergy in that area to innovate and to come up with something new and worthy of showing off. The question in my mind is, absent a direction of innovate in this way, would the composers have innovated in a different way than they did, depending on the acoustics of the building they were composing for? So to reframe that question in more scientific terms, did the acoustics of the changing cathedral in any way make it easier to innovate in the ways that these composers did? Or was the genius of the composer sort of self-contained within the personality of Léonin or Periton or the other composers of Organum Notre-Dame.
I'd be quite interested, and I think what we'll get onto is how is it possible that like the performers may have been driving this a little bit, because there was some improvisation at the time, and so you could imagine in one space in a Gregorian cathedral, they're doing their Gregorian chants, and it's sufficient to fill the space.
Right.
And then you move into this much larger space, and the performers themselves are improvising consistently in order to fill the, like, in order to feel like they're really filling this space.
Right.
And then the composers are just going, oh, yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah.
Let's write that down.
Write that down. That was good.
Yeah. So I wonder if there's some of that. And I think that could be answered a little bit by the work that you're doing, which, so you're specifically trying to take these changes in the architectural features, look in and reproduce it. Right. So you can put performers in those historical spaces.
Yes.
And look at how that changes their performance. So how are you doing that? What sort of methods are you doing to get your performers into the space?
I'm using a little bit of black magic. No.
Is that allowed in Notre Dame?
Yeah.
I thought they were going to kick you out.
Yeah,
that and worshiping other deities, you're just going to be, ooh.
Yeah, I know. I'm really getting myself into some hot water here. No, it's through the wonders of computer technology. And by wonders, of course, I mean strictly scientific and easily explained mathematical principles as implemented through computers.
Magic.
Magic's a lot more fun to say. So you're familiar with the way that sound's propagation through air can be characterized either as a ray or as a wave. And consequently, its propagational paths can be examined either through the wave-based simulations or through an analogy to light and optics. The system I'm using is a geometric approximation, which takes the assumption that in most spaces, most frequencies of sound that are relevant to an architectural experience of a sound field can be approximated through rays. So, of course, it's one thing to draw a box in an acoustic modeling software and say that it sounds like something. It's another thing to draw that box and prove that it sounds like something. So my advisor, Brian Katz, and some former students of his, a few years ago published a paper sort of documenting our team's calibration procedure for modeling existing buildings. It gets pretty technical, but I'll give you sort of the broad overview. Let's say you are modeling a box that exists in the real world. You first start with measurements of that box in the real world.
Yep.
You recreate the dimensions and the material properties of that box in your simulation. And then you begin a calibration procedure that determines, among other things, the impact of scattering in your simulation, how sensitive qualities like reverberation time are to scattering. And then you begin an iterative process of bringing material properties into closer alignment to better match the acoustic energy parameters that are derived from your real world measurements.
So very briefly, so for this one, you've got a reverberation time measurement of the existing cathedral before the fire.
Yes.
And then you went away, you do a geometric model of it. And now you're just iterating through stuff to force the simulated reverberation time to match the real reverberation time. So that's calibrated the existing model.
Yes.
So then you're morphing your geometric model to fit the 3 or 4 different variations that we've talked about.
Yeah. So I just want to note real quick to make sure credit is given where credit is due. I did not create the modern model of the cathedral.
Yeah.
That itself was the work of months of predecessors of mine. So very fortunately, I was able to inherit their model and begin to work from that perspective. But yes, in the case of this particular study of looking at the pre-Gothic and then several iterations of the new Notre-Dame, we started with 2 calibrated models. One was the calibrated model of the 2015 version of the cathedral, and one was a calibrated model of an extant Italian basilica that was located in Rome, whose floor plan and general design fits the remains that have been found underneath Notre-Dame. That particular basilica is interesting by itself because it was built in the 5th century and has remained almost entirely unmodified in the centuries since. But rather than speculating too much, we decided to use that as the calibrated model for the speculative pre-Gothic cathedral, rather than attempting to just blindly set off into the unknown.
Yeah. So now you've got calibrated and adjusted models of your different time periods of Notre Dame.
Yep.
And so you're then trying to take your singers who are singing the different styles of music.
Yes.
And place them virtually within that space.
Yes.
What's the problem with that? Let's go straight to it. What are the problems with doing that?
You're making me tell on myself.
That's what we're here for.
Yes. Okay, so augmented reality and extended reality in the domain of acoustics is something that's under active study.
Yeah.
There are people who have done entire dissertations just on studying the voice in virtual reality or trumpets in virtual reality, to name a couple notable examples. However, most of the research to date that follows a sort of rigorous, multi-sampled analysis of performer adaptation to virtual acoustics has only focused on soloists. And as I've learned, it's for a very good reason.
That feels like the easier problem. Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are issues when it comes to immersing one person in virtual acoustics. You don't really think about it when you're out in the real world interacting with a real space, but you can think of the relative volume of your own noise to the room response as a sort of gain setting that happens naturally. But when you have a virtual room whose level can be set independently of the signal, the digital signal that you insert into that room, you begin to get questions of how do you correctly balance the relationship of the direct sound, that is your mono input into the oralization, with the room response that you have synthetically there in the convolution reverb. So there's a few different methods. There are ways to solve it when you're talking about one singer or one trumpet player, one cellist or one organ player, or, whatever instrument you want to talk about. But when you start dealing with multiple people immersed in virtual reality, particularly if they are not experiencing the same physical sound field, that's when things begin to get a bit tricky.
Yep.
So you have the question of your own self level in relationship to the virtual acoustics. Then there's the question of the level of other people in relationship to their self noise that you are hearing secondhand as a passive listener. there's a question of if you can hear the direct noise in whatever space you're in together, how do you make sure that the direct noise that's traveling to you through the airspace in the room you are both in is correctly balanced with the virtual level of the virtual room that you're hearing over your oralization system?
It feels like the sort of ideal way to do it would be kind of like what you do recording a lot of bands, where you'll stick, the rhythm section in one room. You'll stick the horn section in another room so that you don't get bleed over through the mics, but they're all being mixed live to their headphones, right? And so there's no sonic bleed over between them.
Right.
And they may not even be able to see each other, which I'm sure is weird for some performers.
Yeah.
But particularly with something like a Gregorian chant, I can imagine it's very strange to perform without seeing the other people. And so you kind of need to have them all in one place.
Yeah.
And then it's the question of how do we isolate them and give them all their individual, virtualized environment without because if you and I are sitting here, you're looking at each other and you're trying to put us into a virtual environment, but we're actually in an anechoic chamber.
Right.
You're going to hear my direct speech.
Right.
And that's not going to blend quite right with the oralized speech. Right.
Yeah. And just going back to your example of a recording session with every person laying down their track in their own isolated studio, the choices you make regarding mixing of digital effects are artistically driven.
Yep.
And I love a well-mixed recording. And I am sure that what I'm going to be doing will end up being very beautiful if mixed artistically. But my primary motivation isn't to make it sound good. My primary motivation is to make it sound plausible.
Yep.
So there's the difference between the artistic judgment of is this enough reverb or is it not enough reverb, and the more acoustically minded, is this the appropriate amount of reverb for the building that we're speaking of, or is it inappropriate?
So it seems like the stage you're at now is trying to make sure that you're removing any adaptations that the performers are doing to your oralization itself.
Yes.
Right? Some of the examples you gave were one of the performers conducting everyone throughout the piece, which he wouldn't normally do. Or all of them, for one thing, taking their headphones partly off, which I know, like, when I'm recording with headphones, I always do that because I need to hear but that defeats the whole point, right? Yes. So right now you're trying to solve getting rid of adaptation to your oralization. But your ultimate goal is, once we've solved that, now let's look at the adaptation methods that they're using for the space itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what do you think what are your hypotheses?
That's a good question. I have a couple of, I feel like calling them hypotheses might be too strong. I have a couple of conclusions. I would not be surprised if we came to those conclusions. First, the pre-Gothic model is remarkably different than the other models we're looking at. Notre-Dame is tall and it's relatively narrow. It has a lot of columns, which means you have a lot of diffuse reflection coming back at speakers, but you also have it happening relatively quickly because the columns are not a long distance away. They're, in some cases, merely 2 or 3 meters away from where a singer might have been.
Because that's another point, just to clarify. Specifically in this case, you're looking more at the sound leaving the singer and coming back to the singer.
Yes.
Not to the audience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're looking at how singers can hear themselves.
Yeah.
So Notre-Dame has a very high ceiling. It has reflecting surfaces that return the first reflections very, very early to the singers. You contrast that with a Roman-style basilica. It's still tall, don't get me wrong, but in comparison, it is kind of short and it's kind of wide. The earliest reflecting surfaces are usually separated by a larger distance from the singers, and you don't necessarily have the same overhead volume that you'd get out of a Gothic vaulted arch. So I wouldn't be particularly surprised if the singers reported having a harder time performing the musically complex organum inside the Roman-era basilica, because they might not necessarily be getting the early returning reflections required to maintain a sense of ensemble and a sense of timing with each other.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that, to be clear, but I wouldn't be surprised if we found slightly degraded performance in the pre-Gothic cathedral as opposed to...
I mean, it feels like you kind of already saw a little bit of that in your test when you had 4 singers, each I think it was in the corners of the anechoic chamber.
Yes.
That was when one of the singers needed to conduct.
Yes.
Because I can imagine the anechoic chamber is sucking all the sound out.
Yes.
And so they can't hear across it nearly as well as they normally would expect to.
Right.
But then when he didn't need to do that is when they were in a more traditional, the 4 of them standing next to each other in a crescent. So yeah, I could absolutely imagine that coming out. If you can't hear what's coming back, you can't hear what your neighbor is doing.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you do the more complex? How do you tune? How do you keep time?
Right. As far as the difference between the 1183 and the 1220s era, so micro and miniature Notre-Dame,
Yep.
I'm not sure what I would expect to see there, because on the one hand, micro Notre-Dame, the small one with the large wall dividing the apse from the transept, it has a lot of reflection in it, but in the preliminary room acoustic analysis we've done, you see a distinct acoustic subspace emerging in the portions of the cathedral that were used for religious ceremonies. However, that acoustic subspace still remains when you remove the large wall and open up the length of the transept and the nave. So I honestly, I don't have enough information to begin to speculate what performance metrics might be extracted between those 2 models. They have very significantly different clarity metrics and very significantly different reverberation times. But whether or not the reverberation time is enough to influence the presence of the acoustic subspace inside the liturgical choir remains to be seen.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It was fascinating. I love being able to get back to and think a bit more about music and composition. So this was really nice. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Happy to join you. Thanks for letting me blather on.
All right. The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.
Plus.